My name is Fred, and I want to share with you about opportunities in challenging times. We were living in a village in Mozambique. We went there as a team to go and share the gospel and see how we can bring the gospel in a way where it's not just a spiritual thing, but that we look at the whole person, that we help them physically, that we do community development, that we help them spiritually, that we help empower and develop the people where we are. Now, one of our team members, his name was Pedro. Now, Pedro, he wondered, what can I do? What do I have in my hand? What can I use to be able to do community development, to be able to help these people where we live? And he was a carpenter. So what he did is that he started teaching the young people in the village how to do carpentry. And here is one of the young men, I'll call him Simon. Pedro started a school and a training, and he trained carpenters. And that was a way to befriend the people so that we can empower the young people. Now, Sinoya was a young man, and he was a Muslim like everybody else in the village, but Pedro continued to share with them while they were working and while he was training them. And at the end of the training, Pedro went away on furlough, and Simon called him and he said, Pedro, I just want to thank you. And Pedro was surprised. Yes, why? He says, before I was dependent on my family and I couldn't decide to follow Jesus, but now I'm financially independent and I want to follow Jesus. And that is the question that Pedro asked. What it is in my hand? And I want to ask you today, what is in your hand? You see, when David wanted to slay a giant, what did God use? God used something that was in his hand. What is in your hand? Joshua. And if we read in Joshua 8 verse 18, and Jehovah said to Joshua, stretch out the spear in your hand towards Ai, for I will give it into your hand. And Joshua stretched out the spear in his hand towards the city. That is how God gave the victory to Joshua. He said, what is in your hand? Use what is in your hand. Put out the spear. And that is what Joshua did. Gideon, Judges 7 verse 20. Then the three companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. How did God defeat those armies? With what was in their hands. That's what God used. Samson in Judges 15:15, and he found a new jawbone of a donkey and put forth his hand and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. He had to put his hand forth and take it. What do you have available to you that you can use, that God can use to defeat the enemy? We also have the story of the widow in 2 Kings 4 verse 1 and 2. And Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? And she said, your handmaid has not a thing in the house except a pot of oil. Sometimes we just look down upon the little we have. What is so little for so many people? The disciples asked Jesus about the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And she said, I have nothing except a pot of oil. And the prophet told her to bring all the empty jars, and every empty jar she could put out was filled with the oil. And that is a picture for us. If we have to be empty ourselves, but we have to look, what do we have? And that is what God wants to use and to multiply in our lives. What is in your hand, David? 1 Samuel 17 verse 40, and he took his staff in his hand and he chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook for himself and put them in a shepherd's vessel, which he had, even in a bag. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near the Philistine. And God used that small stone to slay a giant. What is in your hand? The little boy. In John 6, verse 9, it says, there's a boy here. That's what the disciples told Jesus, who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are these among so many? You see, we look down upon the little we have. And especially here in Africa, what do we have? Who told us that we are poor? What is being rich? What do you have? If you have fertile soil, it's a big thing. There's something you can do with it. We shouldn't look at what we don't have, but what we have. But what are these among so many? And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to those who had reclined, and likewise of the fish as much as they want. You see, this is important, that we thank God for what we have and not complain and murmur about what we do not have. But let's thank God for what we have. And the kingdom works differently. It's not limited resources. It's not if someone gets more, someone else will get less. It's about multiplication. God gives something in our hand as in seed form. Well, actually, spiritual things are given in seed form. If you look at the word is a seed, according to the parable of the sower. And it needs to grow. And I believe God, even the gifts, is given in a seed form, and we must develop it. We must take it further. We must grow what we have. Joseph and his master saw that Jehovah was with him, and that Jehovah made all he did to prosper in his hand. See, Joseph was in prison. He was in lockdown. But what was his focus? His focus was to be faithful. His focus was to had his eyes on the Lord, even in prison. And even before that, and that is this verse, with his master, Potiphar. Potiphar recognized the anointing that was on Joseph because of the way he acted, even though he was a slave. He was righteous and he was faithful. Moses, what is in your hand? And Moses answered and said, but behold, they will not believe me, nor listen to my voice. For they will say, Jehovah has not appeared to you. And Jehovah said to him, what is this in your hand? And he said, a staff. You see, many times we look down upon ourselves. What can I do? Who am I? They will not listen to me. And what was God's response when God called Moses to free a whole people group from slavery? And he said, but I'm not good enough. What did God say? God asked him, what is in your hand? And he said, a staff. And you know, it was with that staff that God opened the Red Sea, that the plagues of Egypt came. God used that staff to bring water from the rock. That's what Moses had. But what did it represent, that staff in his hand? It represented his identity, because once he had a scepter in his hand, he was in a palace where he grew up. It also represented his failure, because now he has nothing. He only has, even the sheep is not his, it's his father-in-law's sheep. It represented his potential, because he was going to shepherd a whole people. But it also represented on what he was leaning on. What is your crutch? Because many times we hurt so much and we struggle to cope, so we use something to make ourselves feel better. It was all that he had. He had nothing. He didn't have earthly possessions, but he was a shepherd. That was his identity. But what did he have to do? He had to throw all these things down. He had to throw these things down on the ground and lay down. And then God said, pick it up. Now, it was not easy to pick up a snake, but God let him pick it up again. Take courage and pick up what you have. Give it to me and I will multiply. I will use that, what is in your hand. And in this lockdown, I want to ask you, in this time of change, after the lockdown, nothing is going to be the same again. This is a challenging time. But there's so much opportunity for believers to show God's love in this time, to do things differently. And even in the economy, it's going to change a lot, because suddenly some things are worth more than other things. Suddenly we cannot travel to many places. Suddenly more transport is needed. But what do you have in your hand? Maybe you say, well, I have fertile soil. Maybe you have to ask yourself, what am I good at? Because when the talents was distributed, each one got talents. Not everybody got the same. And we cannot compare with others. What do others have? You have to look at yourself. What do I have? Thank God for it and see how you can use that. And if you have fertile soil, you can use that. What can you do with fertile soil? You can make something. You can make food. Now, a lot of people don't want to go to the market anymore, and they will need food closer to home. So how can we make a small garden? And if we look on the internet, there are opportunities on things we can do to grow food locally. Maybe you have a bicycle. Well, with a bicycle, you can help people do shopping. You can ride. You can make a taxi out of your bicycle to transport people, because the transport is going to go up because less people can get into a taxi or a matatu or whatever you call it. So there are opportunities in this time. We have to look at God and say, God, what did you give me? And if you have one talent only, you have to develop it. You can't bury it and say, I have nothing. You have to develop it and multiply it and let God multiply so that it can be used for his glory, so that when he can come back, you can present and say, this is what you gave me, this is what I did with it. And we will hear God's voice say, well done, good and faithful servant. This is Geraldo. He was another one of our team members that went with us to the village. And Geraldo was a great guy. And he really had a heart for the medical field. But he couldn't study to be a doctor. But he went to do a course to use the microscope, and he got a microscope. And in the village, he started there. In the clinic, we opened a small clinic, and the government was so excited because this was the first clinic in the districts outside of the main town of the district in Mozambique. And the government really opened the doors for us and said, come and do it in other places. But it's because of Geraldo. He was so faithful. And with his microscope that worked by solar, he didn't even need electricity. He could do tests. And actually, the mortality rate of malaria came right down because of Geraldo's involvement. And you know, because of Geraldo's faithfulness, people saw it. And donors came and they built a big hospital in that village. A hospital in many ways better equipped than the bigger provincial hospital. And Geraldo now, this ordinary guy, is now the director of the hospital. You see, God gives us something. And if we are faithful in the little, he will give us more. And I want to encourage you and leave you with this question. What is in your hand? Bless you.